Welcome to the N1 Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Marcus Sadu, and today we've got Dr. James Hoffman on the show. Now, James is with the same company that Dr. Mike Israetel is with, and they're actually good buds. So if you liked episode number 61 with Dr. Mike Israetel, How to Eat for Health, Body Composition, and Performance, you're probably going to like this one too. They have a very similar sense of humor, and they're super entertaining as far as bringing the humor with the knowledge and all that good stuff. So James is coming on the show to chat about all things recovery. So what you need to think about when it comes to recovering from your workouts, what you need to think about when it comes to recovering from, stressors in life, and then just life in general. So we're going to focus on general principles to recovery, and then we're also going to get into stuff like massage and cupping, dry needling, sauna, steam, ice baths, all that sort of fancy stuff as well. So I hope you guys enjoy this interview. Let's get into it. James, welcome to the show, my man. Thanks for taking the time to be with us today.
Oh man, thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
So before we dig into all things recovery, can you just give us a little bit of background on yourself and how you got into all this health and fitness stuff originally?
Yeah, for sure. I've always been involved in sports and stuff growing up my whole life. I did a lot of wrestling, rugby, football, martial arts, all those kind of sports growing up. And I ended up doing my undergrad in biochemistry, but I ended up getting a minor in kinesiology. And then I was like, man, I like this stuff so much more. I was trying to do pre-pharm, and I was just like, forget this. This is boring. I'm into the exercise stuff. I'm into training. So then I went and got a master's in exercise phys, and then I later got my PhD in sport physiology. And that's really how that all kind of got rolling. I've always been involved in exercise and sport, and then I got my education in it and just been going crazy ever since. So, and somehow I ended up in this crazy hypertrophy RP world. I don't know how I ended up here, but life's good. I really enjoy it, and I get to talk to a lot of people and do a lot of cool things.
Awesome, man. So this might sound like a little bit of a silly question to kick it off, but what exactly is recovery and why is it so important?
Yeah, not silly at all. So recovery is kind of a big, broad topic that I think is often underappreciated in the sense that people pay it a lot of lip service, like, oh, recovery is important, but they don't actually do anything that's kind of promoting that in their life. So recovery essentially is looking at across different time scales, right? Whether it's session to session or week to week or month to month, day to day, whatever, even within the same day. Are you able to provide an overload stimulus in each subsequent session after you train, right? So if you have a hard training session, can you provide a good training stimulus the next time you train, whether it's the next day or later that same day or next week, right? Can you provide an overload, right? And so that's kind of the big idea. Can I do a really hard training session, get back to normal so that I can do another hard training session later? And if we're going to be a little bit more technical on it, that next subsequent session has to be a little bit harder than the first one that you did to satisfy our overload progressive component. So when we start factoring in training multiple times per week, even multiple times per day, we start to find that recovery can be a limiting factor for a lot of people where they train really, really hard, but by the time they're supposed to train again, they just don't have enough gas left in the tank to really provide a good stimulus, and that can cause their gains to slow down. It can cause their gains to completely plateau and stalemate, and in really, really bad cases, actually start to see negative returns where they're just actually getting worse than they were before. So it becomes a really, really interesting topic, and it can be applied across all populations, whether it's more just people trying to be healthy and fit, people trying to look good for Instagram, or people who are trying to be aspiring athletes. So it's an important topic for everybody.
Yeah, totally, man. Now, in your recovery book, you've got this principles-based approach to recovery, or a hierarchy, because not all recovery strategies are created equal. So can you walk us through your recovery hierarchy as you see it?
Yeah, for sure. So the hierarchy came out of necessity because we had, when we were working on the book, there were so many ideas, and we're like, oh man, there's so many things that are worth talking about. Some of them are more impactful than others. Some of them are more practical than others. We need to put this in a usable format so people know, yes, there are all these different things that you can do. Like you can look at carbohydrate intake. You can look at things like cupping or massage or even therapy. These are all things that are noteworthy, but not all of these things are weighted equally, right? And so that was kind of the big challenge. So in our hierarchy, we tried to clump them together into similar groups of things, right, that it could at least share similarities in how they're approached or how they're implemented. And then we tried to rank order them in terms of how much impact they have and how practical they are to use. So For us, we started at the base. Our most important thing was training within the volume landmarks, which is our fancy technical tool set we use to describe how much training you should actually be doing. And so what that basically says is, am I training enough to make progress? Because if I'm not, then recovery is not really a limiting factor at this point. I really just need to train more if I want to get better. Boom. And on the other end, we have training too much, where I'm actually just doing so much stuff, I can't recover from it. And this is more of a problem you see in sporting populations, where they might train 3 times a day, 5-6 days a week, right? And they're just doing too much stuff, they can't recover. For people who are just trying to be healthy and fit, usually this is not a limiting factor, but it can be. So it's definitely noteworthy. And once you exceed that training volume, once you're training too much, there's no amount of like cocaine or carbohydrates you can do to fix that. You got to back off. There's a choke point, right? So that was our big one at the bottom, where we said, this is the first roadblock, the first choke point. If you don't have this in order, you're not going to be doing as well as you could. Then we moved into our passive strategies, right, which are very, very powerful. And as the name kind of implies, the fatigue is meant to kind of dissipate from you passively, meaning you're not really doing anything specific. It just kind of comes out of you, right? Kind of like diffusion. And that looked at things like sleep, relaxation and stress management, and taking some planned off days throughout the week. And so we found those were really, really powerful, another big choke point along the way. Then we got into kind of more of my bread and butter, which was like the active recovery stuff, which is more of how can you keep training and dissipate some of that fatigue at the same time, which is kind of an interesting conundrum. Like, I train and I'm losing fatigue. Weird. So there's a bunch of different strategies we can use for that. So that was a little bit more in my wheelhouse with my background. We also looked at nutrition, right, where we said there's a bunch of really important things for nutrition. And we said those two categories are probably about the same. It's hard to say that one is more important than the other. Like, we know that deloading is really important, but can we say that deloading is more important than calories or getting enough protein or carbohydrates every day? It's hard to say, right? So we said they're probably about the same. And then we moved up to our kind of least important things, our tip of our pyramid. We had what we called therapeutic and supplemental strategies, which is things like social support, massage, compassionate touch, things along those lines. And then the last one we had are very much supplemental strategies, which are things like ice, heat, compression, things along those lines. And so the reason why we did it that way was because what we found is that people tended to gravitate a lot towards the things that are new, fun, unique, sexy, novel, right? And it turns out those things, although often do have a good effect, the effect is so small that it's not even worth talking about. Where I'm sure you've had this too with clients or people asking you like, what do you think about cupping? What do you think about doing ice bath? It's like, okay, maybe there's something there, but your lifestyle is shit, homie. Maybe you should stop smoking. Maybe you should get some sleep every now and again. Maybe not be stressed out all the time, right? Those are things that are important and tangible. It's going to affect your life. Whereas, like, yeah, if you have a shit lifestyle and you add an ice bath, you're going to be slightly better, but you still have a huge problem of a shit lifestyle, right? And so that was kind of the idea with our book, was trying to find a way to convey these ideas and say, don't waste your time on the minutia. Get the basic stuff right, and you'll be so much better off for it. And then you can explore the fun, sexy things once those bases are covered.
Yeah, that's a really important point about what you mentioned around adding things, because I think that that's sort of like a flaw almost in human psychology. It's like, okay, what else can I do, right? And as opposed to being like, how can I focus on the basics, or maybe even take some things away? Because like you were saying, no matter what you do, you can't recover from too much training in general.
Exactly, right? And it's kind of a funny thing because you don't want to punish people for the mindset of like, I would like to try and improve my position by doing something more, right? That's an admirable way of thinking. That's a good hard work ethic way of thinking, right? I need to do more things to make myself better. But the reality is if you can just add more things, you're probably doing a bad job with the things that you're already managing. And it turns out the things that you're already managing, like your training, your lifestyle, your nutrition, those are probably going to be more impactful. The thing is, sometimes it's easier to just look at something like an ice bath and say, I can just add an ice bath for 10 minutes a day. That's not a huge pain in the butt, right? But reworking my whole life to accommodate the rigors of hard training, like having a set time to wake up, a set time to train, a set time to go to bed, having my meals planned out, having my stress management and relaxation planned out throughout the day, those things are hard to tackle. It's easy to talk about. You say, oh, you should relax more. But doing it is incredibly difficult. And I think that's why that mindset comes about, where it's like, Could I rework my whole life? Yeah, I could do that. Oh, but there's this ice bath or there's this compression sleeve that I can just put that on, right? And it's going to make me better. And it's just more of a fun, quick fix type thing rather than the rigors of like going through the grind and doing everything right all the time. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, man. I love that. Now, at home, what are some of the signs that someone might be under recovered? So, for example, they might be experiencing excessive achy joints, or maybe their sleep starts to get, interrupted and fragmented, et cetera, et cetera. So what are some of the signs that folks should be on the lookout for when it comes to potentially being under recovered?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we're looking at recovery, we're generally looking at two different kind of types of fatigue that we're monitoring, right? There is kind of local or what we call peripheral fatigue, which is the fatigue you feel in the muscles and in the joints and in the body parts you trained, right? So if you trained your chest, is your chest really sore? Does it feel weak? Does it feel tight? All of those things, right? We also can look at what we call central fatigue, right? Which is where you start to see more kind of system-wide problems where your mood, your affect starts to tank, right? Your sleep can be disrupted. Your ability to actually execute good technique becomes impaired, things like that. So we can look at it from both perspectives. So on the local side, right, if you're kind of finding yourself under recovered, you find that you're between times that you train muscle groups, like let's say your legs, you have overlapping soreness all the time, right, where you're just always sore. Every time you train legs, it's sore until you train legs again, and it's just a perpetual level of soreness. If you start to feel like really, really gnarly aches in your joints that kind of started small and started to creep up into like tendinitis type things, that's no good. And probably the most important one on the local level is performance. Like, have you noticed that your ability to maintain high weights or high reps or high number of sets is not improving? In fact, it's actually staying the same or starting to go down. If you see it going down, that's a huge indication that you are being under recovered from session to session or week to week, right? And that's all at the local level. On the system-wide level, some really kind of hallmark things to look out for is really, really big changes in your mood. If you find yourself becoming unusually irritable or just kind of frustrated, anxious, or sometimes people will report that they feel their world is kind of collapsing around them. So basically like having nihilistic thoughts like, fuck this, I can't do anything, the world is killing me, like I can't do anything about it, right? Those types of thoughts, they come up, that's usually a good sign that you are overreaching. A couple other things to keep an eye out for are sleep disturbances, like if you're finding you just having a hard time falling asleep for no apparent reason. If your hunger is gone, like if you know you should feel hunger, but the thought of food is kind of repulsive to you for seemingly no reason, that's a bit off. And if you find yourself becoming more vulnerable to being sick, like if you find yourself getting colds and sniffles and stuff all the time, that's a really good sign that on the net, you're probably overdoing it a little too much.
Yeah, those are great takeaways. Now, what would you say to someone that, say, has kids and or works long hours, and by the time that they get everything done at the end of the day, they should technically go to sleep because they need that 7 to 8 hours, right? But they also feel like they need some time to decompress or relax and maybe watch a show or, hit the Netflix or something like that. But watching that show makes it so they don't get enough sleep. So how do you recommend folks sort of approach situations like this? Because it's so common.
Yeah, that's a great question, because normally I would say you want to do both of those things. And I thought you were segueing me into the sleep one, but you caught me off guard. That's a great question. So normally what we would say is if you have aspirations to be as the fittest self you can be, whether that's just being healthy and fit for longevity and quality of life, that's great. If you want to be, buff and be the best physique person that you can be, that's great too. If you want to be an athlete, that's great. If you're in that boat where you're trying to really push the limits of your physical accomplishments, I would prioritize sleep over that decompression time. As much as I am a fan of that decompression time, I would say sleep's probably the bigger thing. If you are like most of us, like myself included, where you train hard, you take it very seriously, but it's not the biggest priority in your life. You have other things, like you said, work, kids, maybe other just priorities. No shame in admitting that. Fitness is not the number one, right? Then I would say if it helps you improve your quality of life without disrupting your schedule too much, like if you can lose 45 minutes of sleep and have it not really negatively impact you on the net throughout the day, and it gets you that time to decompress, maybe spend time with your kids or your significant other or your pets that you would otherwise not have, I think that's a fair trade-off. But the key here is understanding it's a trade-off, right? You're trying to gain something at the cost of something else. And in this case, you're losing some minutes of sleep, which could impact your recovery and your performance in subsequent exercises, but you're improving your quality of life and your happiness by getting that time with either catching up on shows, spending it with friends and family, pets, loved ones, etc. So I think that's a reasonable trade-off.
Yeah, I like that. I like that approach, and just sort of balance. It's a balancing act, right? Seeing what's more important at that given time.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you probably have this with your clients and stuff too, where people will be overly rigid. They'll be like, I have to do all of these things. And it's like, dude, are you trying to get to the Olympia? Are you trying to get to the World Cup for soccer? No, of course not. So what? It doesn't matter. It's okay to not be on the most strict regimented program ever if other things in your life bring you joy and happiness. You know what I mean?
Totally, man. Totally. Now, you mentioned therapy, and I feel like that's, or community, or however somebody wants to look at that, but I feel like that's a really underrated aspect of recovery, because that mental and emotional game really impacts our physical body as well. You can't separate those things.
Oh, yeah.
So what is how do you think about that, and how do you have those conversations with folks?
It's tough because I am not a trained psychology person at all. My wife, Melissa, is. And so she was able to help me a lot on that part of the project. But it's one of those undeniable things. You can't just do a PubMed search and find, social support, therapy, psychology, and recovery. It's not something that comes up, but it's something that is also undeniably present, both anecdotally and in the literature, where we find that people who are able to maintain a positive mental state, whether it's through meditation practices, self-awareness practices, social support therapy, a combination of all of those things, seem to be slightly better off than those who do not. So it's kind of a weird conundrum, and it's kind of hard to put into words. So what we did find, and we wanted to pay some lip service to, was the idea of having a support group around yourself, whether it's friends, family, loved ones, coaches, or even therapists. It turns out that just knowing that somebody gives a shit about you in this world pays massive dividends. And as silly and maybe as demeaning as that sounds, it's absolutely true. And there's something very tangible about knowing that there is another human being in this world that is invested in my outcomes, the outcomes that I have chosen, not just whether or not I live or die, the outcomes that I have chosen for my path. And they said, you know what? We support you. We want you to get those to the best of your ability. And that pays huge dividends in someone's personal and mental state. So one of the things that we kind of advocate for is trying to maintain a good, what we call internal locus of control, which is, although I am not the master of this world, I am the captain of my ship, and I'm going to steer the ship in this world to the best of my ability. All the good things, all the bad things that come are on me, right? And I can blame the world for all the badness, all the sickness, all the misfortune, all the privilege, whatever you want to call it. That all is going to happen whether I choose to act or not. So all I can do is steer my ship and take responsibility for it. And people who are able to do that typically have better psychological and then later better overall performance and well-being outcomes than those who are willing to throw their cards up in the air and say, I'm a slave to the world, more or less. You know what I mean?
Totally, man. That's a really powerful message, because it empowers everybody to be like, okay, this is what I can control. This is what I can't necessarily control, but I'm going to focus on what I can and sort of leave the rest up to whatever.
Yeah. And people who care about you can help you get back on track. It's normal to get off track. It's normal to have doubts, to get into funks, right? And having that group of people, whether it's a therapist or your spouse or your friends, family, whomever it is, teammates, coaches, they can help you get back to where you want to be, and having that support network is important. So that's why we included it in the book. It was one of those things, again, hard to kind of quantify and put into exercise science terms, but also undeniable at the same time.
Yeah, I think it might be of interest for folks, because it's hard to quantify, how do you personally set up your support network and things like that? And obviously your wife is a specialist in this area, so that helps a lot. But how do you sort of go about this area?
I am probably, I would fall under the toxic masculinity side of things, where I probably do a really bad job on this. I probably need to do a better job. But I think one of the things that I have done that has made this part of my life a little bit better is being as honest as I can be at all times. Now, obviously, there are some times in life that requires some tact and maybe some tiptoeing around difficult issues. But what I have found is that when you can communicate openly, honestly and non-confrontationally with the people around you, it does make things a lot easier. Although sometimes what you find is being honest kind of leads to maybe more confrontations or maybe more difficult discussions. But ultimately, it opens you and them up to this notion of like, everything's on the table. Let's put it out there. Let's get to the root of some of these issues. And then we can just move on and deal with it rather than tiptoeing around it, leading to things like resentment, guilt, or frustration, just building and building and building. It's like, don't say things are okay when they're not okay. Don't say that you're doing fine when you're not doing fine. It's okay to say, I'm in a funk right now, and I feel like what I'm doing is pointless, or I feel like I'm wasting my time, right? And just being able to put it out there helps a lot, because then the people around you can at least know how you're feeling, and whether or not they can give you the guidance that you need doesn't matter. They can at least be there and know what you're going through and support you the best way that they can. And I think that's something that we could probably all do a little bit of a better job on, and myself included.
That's great advice, man. I think what I'm getting from that is it sort of comes down to open communication, opening up those channels, and just sort of, not having to walk on eggshells around people, just opening it up.
Yeah, and so Mike and I are a great example of that. Although we work together, we do everything together, we don't always agree on everything. And Mike and I can absolutely say, like, I don't agree with you, you don't agree with me, we'll work it through, and then we're friends. We never stop being friends. We love each other very much, and it's just one of those things, like, sometimes it's tough to work with your friends, but if you're open and honest with people, you can convey your ideas in a respectful, productive way, and each party knows that it's not being hurtful, it's not being malicious, and we're just trying to get to the best resolution that we can. And so I think it's really important, especially with people that you have to deal with day to day.
Now, Mike is he's been on the podcast before, so the listeners will know Dr. Mike Isertel. He's a really logical guy, and you seem to be the same way. So is that something that you built and worked on, or is that something that came a little more naturally? Because I know for a lot of folks, they'll be like, man, that sounds really hard to just talk about anything and open up those communication channels, everybody at all times sort of thing.
It's hard. It's not easy. And it's something you have to practice. And the natural tendency, I think, when you start this idea of maybe being a little bit more mindful, a little bit more truthful of what you say, the natural tendency is to come off overly aggressively, right? Where you're like, you're wrong. No, I don't agree with that. Like you tend to be a little bit more jumpy. So it does take a little practice being able to do it tactfully, do it respectfully, and convey the tone of, although I don't agree with you, or although we're not seeing eye to eye, I still care about you, and I want to make a resolution with whatever we're not seeing eye to eye on. And it takes practice. And I think when you have people who are Sam Harris has a really great way of putting this, where it's he talks about having good faith conversations, right? Where both parties assume that the other party has something to offer, and that they are both trying to get to like a mutual kind of truth or understanding. When you have that mindset, it makes it a lot easier. When you have the kind of like bro machismo posturing mindset of like, well, I read this PubMed article, well, I did it this way, like you just get nowhere. It's a bad faith where one person's just trying to be dominant over the other, and you just get nowhere.
Yeah, I've heard Sam say something similar to that, in that he's willing to have a conversation with essentially anybody that he feels has good intentions behind whatever idea that they're bringing to the forefront.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that listening to Sam actually has helped me a lot in this process with some of that stuff. And it's for the better. I mean, when you can put things out there, all the people who care about you or are invested, you can at least try and make things better with you. You know what I mean? Rather than just suffering internally in your toxic masculinity brooding ground. So it's challenging, but it just takes a little bit of practice.
Now, shifting gears a little bit to supplements for recovery, because you see some of these like recovery drinks out there with maybe a little bit of BCAAs in them, or maybe even caffeine, which is really ironic because that's exactly what you don't want to recover. But how do supplements fit or not fit into this whole thing, and where on the hierarchy you mentioned that they're closer to the top?
Yeah, so supplements are a really funny thing. Like myself, when I was young, like as an undergrad or late high school student, I was so deep into that supplement game, right? I'd come in with a duffel bag. It was like suburban drug cartel guy where you zip open the bag and you're like, what you need, bro? I got L-carnitine. I got all this shit, right? Or I remember Extend was really big at the time when I was kind of coming up. And people were just like bathing in Extend, dumping it all over themselves because Lane Norton was plugging it for a long time. And so what we have found is that supplements do have their uses. They can be beneficial. But in terms of recovery, they're really overshadowed just by good nutritional practices for the most part. Now, supplements can help people as a means to an end, right? Get high-quality protein sources, get fast-digesting carbohydrate sources, get supplemental things like more creatine in their diet. But in terms of what is their actual impact, oh man, it's so small. It's one of those almost laughable type things. We're talking about like fractions of a percentage in the big grand picture of things. So for the most part, if your calories are good, if your protein carbs are good, and like if your nutrient timing is reasonable for the most part, you really don't have to fuss with supplements too much. I think whey protein is still a good choice around workout times. I think casein protein is still a good idea for prolonged periods with no feeding, like bedtime, for example. And I think creatine is probably still a good idea. And then if you like fast digesting carbs, that's also not too shabby. But outside of that, there's not much else. Right? And those things are just relatively small impact things. So they can be useful. I think when you're dealing with like collegiate or professional athletes, for example, who are training maybe 3 times a day, like hard training sessions 3 times a day, supplements can become increasingly useful, especially things like fast digesting protein and carbohydrates. But we're talking about people who are really high-level aspiring athletes. For people who are just kind of living for health and fitness and just to have a reasonable body comp, supplements are such a small thing, it's not worth breaking the bank or perseverating over too much.
Yeah, that totally makes sense, man. And something like a whey protein or a fast digesting protein or even a slower one, casein, you can get in whole food like dairy, the casein's in there, or you can get, so you don't have to be creatine. I mean, you can eat some red meat and stuff like that. So it's not something that you have to get via supplement form.
Absolutely not. And you can even get like, they have some of that stuff at Walmart now. You can get Walmart brand like proteins and creatine and stuff. So it's like, even if you want to go that route, you don't have to break the bank. And I see people will get the like $60 schmegmalate or whatever. And you're just like, I have no idea what this is. I don't know why you're paying $60 for this, but they can be useful. It's just not worth fussing over, really, is the idea.
Okay, cool, man. Now, I'd love to get into a little bit of myth busting. You mentioned, cupping. There's things like dry needling, chiro, physio massage, compression. I mean, it goes on forever. There's so much shit out there. I just really want to drive this point home. How do you communicate when is the right time, if at all, for someone to go down that sort of route?
Yeah, so in the actual recovery book itself, at the very last chapter, there's a what I call a recovery toolbox, which is a series of, I think, like 10 or maybe 11 questions that kind of help you whittle down whether or not something like this is worth your time, right? So the first couple of things we generally look at, as a scientist, it's hard not to do this. We want to go straight to the literature, right? Is there any literature to support this thing that we're trying to look at, right? If there's not, which in our field, things come and go so fast, and research is a very slow process, there might not be any literature. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but we should at least kind of wag the finger a little bit and say, I don't want to put too much stock into this because we just don't know that much about it yet. So if there's no scientific literature to fall back on that says this is probably a decent strategy, all that means to me is let's just table it for now. That means it's not bad. It's not necessarily good. Let's just table it and wait and see, right? We can also start to look at other things like, can we actually identify a mechanism of action? Is there something that we can clearly identify at the cellular level where this promotes either recovery, adaptation, or both? So is there something clear, theoretical, logical, documented that shows that, yes, this should work, right? If there's that, that's a green light. If not, we say probably table it. And if it actually shows like a negative, so like caffeine's a good example of a negative, right? Where it actually activates the other pathways that are opposing recovery. It activates energy deriving pathways. So we'd say that actually works in the other direction. That's a red light. That's no. So we're going to say no on that. And then we can start to fall back on other things like more anecdotal or experiential things like, do I have friends or do I have clients or have I used this myself? Have I done data collection on myself where I've seen this thing starting to work in the real world and people seem to have a good positive vibes about it? Okay, that's not bad. Maybe it's worth talking about. But ideally, what we want is to kind of check all of these boxes where we say the science says it works. There's a clear mechanism of action. It clearly promotes recovery. I've used it. I've myself, my other clients, clearly I've done it. It's practical. It works. Boom. If we can kind of hit all of those boxes, it's probably good to go. More likely scenario is it's going to hit some of those boxes, but not others. And all that means is, you know what? Just table it for now. You can maybe experiment with it. You can maybe see if other people are using it, but just don't spend a lot of time and money. The thing is, like, these things come and go like the wind. I'm a big MMA fan, and I can't tell you how many events where you see guys that have the cup marks all over their backs, right? And it's like a funny thing where you look at the literature on cupping, and up until recently, it was very inconclusive. And now, most recently, it seems to be giving kind of a negative trend where it doesn't seem to have anything worthwhile to do outside of just placebo effect. So, it's one of those things like, yeah, other people might be doing it, and it seems like a fun, new, sexy thing. But as a scientist, it's hard not to defer to what does the science say on the topic. And if there's no science, or the science is maybe not painting it in the best light, don't bother with it. Just wait, and time will tell whether or not it's a good issue or not. You got plenty. Here's the thing, right? You got plenty to work with lifestyle, training, sleep, nutrition, all that. You got plenty of tools to work with already, and people just want to overlook those things like, oh, yeah, that's there. I can always kind of work on that. Let me just see what's going on over here, right? No, turn the shit back around, right? Are you doing a good job on your training? Are you doing a good job with your sleep, with your relaxation? Do you have a good network of social support? Is your food in order, right? Those are hard things to manage, and those are the most impactful things to manage. So wait on those fun, sexy things until there's a more clear picture.
It's funny how some of these things take off, because I feel like I remember Michael Phelps at one of the Olympics or something having cupping marks on his back, and then like cupping just went insane. The popularity just skyrocketed.
Oh, yeah. I remember we did a seminar once, and we were talking about cupping, and one person like chimed in and they were like, oh, I have experience with cupping. I was like, oh, cool. So like, what did you think about it? And she was like, oh, well, we do it for like medicinal therapeutic reasons. I'm like, oh, okay. Did you have any like sport or, training related effects? She was like, oh, absolutely not. No, of course not. Like immediately dismissed it. It was just like, oh, no, that's not why we do it. And I was like, oh, so like, why do you do it? And the answer is, for non-exercise reasons, essentially, right? Without being too harsh.
Sure.
So you just because somebody, so like one of the things that we try to convey in our field is like people are often massively successful in spite of doing stupid things, right? And I'm trying to be cheeky about it, but we see people using really, really bad methodology, whether it's training or recovery or cupping or whatever, and they're still successful, right? That doesn't mean that the methodology that they used was good. It just means that they were going to be a champion. They were going to win. They were going to be good no matter what. They are successful in spite of doing bad things, right? And that's the problem that you run into, where people want to use the kind of the name drop, the anecdote where you say like Michael Phelps does this, Michael Jordan does this, Kobe does this, right? And it's like, yeah, but they're Kobe. He's going to be Kobe no matter what he does. It doesn't matter. You know what I mean? And that's the problem. It's hard to kind of convey that to people where they say like, but all the best people in the world are doing it, so shouldn't I do it? It was like, well, you're not the best person in the world, so it doesn't matter.
It's tricky because those are the stories that get circulated, right? And we love to hop onto that stuff. I remember seeing Chad Johnson. He was a receiver in the NFL that was really good with Cincinnati, and he ate McDonald's every single day. And it's like, well, he's a freak. He's a freak.
Yeah. Does that mean you should eat McDonald's every day? Probably not. Like success does not necessarily indicate like sound methodology. And I think that's one of the things that in our field it's very difficult to convey. And it's hard to argue against also, because it's like, okay, you have to present the case now. The burden is because people will just jump to the anecdote and say, well, see that guy? Boom. Right. And you have to go, okay, well, now I have to build this huge case of pros and cons, theory, application. Right. And it can be exhausting.
Totally, man. Now, this is a little bit of, potentially a rabbit hole question, but taking something like massage, for example. So how do you think about separating the potential benefits of someone just getting your hands on you versus the actual benefits from the massage and manipulating the body itself? Now, I know it's impossible to separate, but some folks just tend to like love massages. It helps them, quote unquote, recover aside from the physiological benefits potentially. So I love massages. I'm one of those people. It's like literally one of my favorite things in the world. But how do you think about a situation like this where possibly there are so many confounding factors at play?
I have thought about this quite a bit, and it's a really difficult one to piecemeal out. So here's the good news, right? Whether or not there is a massive effect of somebody putting their hands on you, and research does suggest that there is an effect there, like it tends to just downregulate all nervous system activity, which on the net seems to have more of an anabolic effect than a catabolic effect. So it seems to just be a big, massive turnoff for all systems, which seems to put you in a more anabolic state for the most part. Not always true, but for the most part. So that's cool, but the evidence on that is a little bit more limited. Now, on the other hand, massage feels great, right? No one will debate that. Massage always makes you feel good. So that's really positive, improves your perception of fatigue, things like that. It also forces you to put down your phone, put down whatever it is you're doing, and whether it's for 30 minutes or an hour, right? You are just going to lay flat, supine, or on your stomach or whatever and do nothing for the next 30 minutes to an hour, right? So now You're doing good stress management by not constantly being on your device, fussing around with emails, texts, whatever. You're also using relaxation. You are also using social support to some extent because the person that you are entrusting to touch you, you have enough rapport with them to relax and know that they are not going to be violating you, hopefully, right? And then you also get the benefit of whatever compassionate touch effects there are. So it's hard to piecemeal those things out. But needless to say, like, there's definitely something there, right? At the very least, you're quadruple dipping on 4 potentially really good outcomes. Now, how powerful those things are on the whole, it can be variable. It's hard to say, but I think it's one of those things. Like, if somebody, so here's my thing as a coach, right? If somebody is like, hey, I do massage like 2 or 3 times a week, right? On the one hand, I can go and get on my exercise science high horse and be like, that's really stupid, brother. Like, it doesn't really do what you think it does. And what is that going to get me, right? So that all that does is disrupts the confidence and efficacy of the client of what they have been doing and whatever they're getting into with me, right? So they're immediately going, this guy just like shat on my lifestyle for the last several years, and now he's potentially wanting to take that away. That's a huge psychological burden when you're dealing with somebody who you're trying to build a rapport with, right? If you have a new client or somebody who's kind of coming around to you, you're trying to build trust and rapport. Now you're just shitting on what they've been doing, right? That's terrible. Now, are you maybe righteous and virtuous in telling them that maybe it's not the best use of their time? Sure, right? But all you've done is essentially put up a big barrier between you. Now, you could also just say, hey, that's cool. Like, I can present you with some stuff if you're interested more on massage. And if not, we'll just leave it alone, right? We don't have to talk about it. And like, what harm is it really doing? The only harm that we really see is an opportunity cost to do something else, right? And that's not a huge deal, right? They could just be spending that time either training more maybe or doing work or whatever, maybe just doing other relaxation stuff. But it's one of those like, it doesn't necessarily do what people often think it does. It also is probably still doing a lot of good at the same time, whether that's directly or indirectly, right? At the very least, it's getting them to relax for an hour. Boom. That's a fantastic outcome. So one of the things I've thought of too is it's kind of a means to an end. Like if you have a client who is chronically stressed out all the time, like maybe they're a lawyer or a stockbroker or a doctor, and they're just always wigging out and they just can never find time to do good relaxation practices, massage is a good means to that end. Just say, hey, why don't you go get a massage once a week? Is it really the massage that you want them to get? No. What you're trying to get them to do is relax and have a better like state of mind, better state of like perception of fatigue, all those things, right? That's what you're trying to get. The massage is just an avenue to get there, right? And so I think that can be really, really useful. People like were not thrilled about the picture we painted about massage in the context of recovery. So, and they often think like, man, you guys are really shitting on massage all the time. And it's like, we might be presenting that image, and maybe we did a bad job on that, but I still think it's a useful tool. And at the very least, in terms of recovery, it's probably a good use of time on the net, even if it's not getting the results you think it's getting. Do you know what I mean?
I do, man. Yeah. And I think for the coaches out there, that the important point on that one is to meet a client where they're at. And if somebody's getting a benefit from something and it's not inherently harmful, and you said the only opportunity cost is of doing something else, then hey, like, awesome. Like, keep doing it.
Yeah. And like, and telling them to stop comes at a huge cost to you, right? Where now they just don't trust you, or they think you're a dickhead, and it's just going to take longer and longer for you to build that rapport. So it's one of those like, pick and choose your battles wisely. There's no need to like, even if it's placebo, right? Who cares if they think they're getting something out of it, even though you know that they're not? Let them figure it out, and if they want to ask you questions, be open to that, but don't force your values and ideas on them necessarily.
Totally, man. These confounding factors are an interesting thing to explore. I remember there was a bunch of research in the past, maybe a year or two, around sauna and the benefits of, heat shock proteins and stuff. But then what you can't measure is like, again, you're not looking at your phone. A lot of these people in these studies were older men that actually used the sauna and steam rooms as, social and community time. And they might be talking about life and doing all of these other things that you can't just isolate and study on their own.
100%. And that's why the passive recovery section was like really difficult for us to kind of piecemeal together, because it just tends to be a confounder on everything. People will like look at breathing techniques or yoga or something, and it's like, yeah, there's probably nothing there. All that really is doing is getting you to relax, right? And just be in a reduced state of alertness or arousal. And that's great. And it just tends to confound everything. And like you said, going and hanging out with your homies in the sauna and just like cracking jokes for a couple hours might be an awesome just hangout time, right? And you might, and sometimes they'll do food and snacks in there too. It's like, I don't know if you've ever seen like the Russian bathhouses, but they go big. Like they fan each other with the leaves. They get like sausages and vodka. It's like a party in there. A sausage party, actually, it turns out. But anyway, but yeah, all these things tend to confound. So when you're looking at research, it can be kind of difficult to figure out, like, is there actually an effect of this specific thing, or can this just be explained by something else simple like relaxation, which for me was the kind of the big epiphany I had writing the book, was like, all this other bullshit is just avenues to get people to relax, right? The idea of relaxing, going from a heightened or aroused state to your kind of basal state, is probably one of the most important things that you need to be able to do. And all these activities are just avenues to get there. They don't actually have their own unique effects. So you're totally right. It's very difficult to kind of differentiate and piecemeal those things apart.
Yeah, man. Now, this has been great, James. Before we get to where folks can find you, if you were to sort of boil down our chat today into a take-home message, idea, or thought process that you'd like to leave folks with around recovery, where would you steer folks?
Absolutely. So there's tons of things that you can look at in context of recovery. There's infinite little fun things to do, but the most impactful things generally revolve around doing a good job on your training, like doing enough training to make sure you're making progress, but not so much that you're crippled all the time, right? And then managing your lifestyle, which is basically making sure you get enough sleep, having some downtime, some relaxation, unwinding time throughout the day, having people around you that care about you, and then actually just doing a reasonable job with your nutrition. So basically not eating trash all the time. Can you get more specific into the actual calories and timing and how often should you be doing deloads to training paradigms and all that stuff? Yes, there is absolutely plenty of room for discussion there. But at the end of the day, right, live a balanced lifestyle where you train hard, but you have some downtime, you eat well, and you're able to make progress for the most part. After that, it all becomes a matter of trade-offs. If you want more, you have to trade off more of the things that you love to get more of the progress that you want. Or if you want more things that you love in your life and less fitness and training stuff, you can back those down and have more fun. It's just a matter of what brings you the most joy on the net.
Amazing stuff, man. Now, before I forget, I wanted to ask you one thing about potentially research around just something as simple as walking. Like, did you guys cover that in the book around walking? And obviously, again, one of those things where there's so many other confounding factors, but getting some general movement in, some outside time, light exposure, all that good stuff.
I think we barely scratched the surface on that. I think maybe we talked about it in terms of like taking a light day. And I think we might have talked about it in terms of like maybe improving mood and affect. But walking is a huge one, especially when you're dealing with people who are like non-sporting populations, where maybe you have somebody who's trying to lose weight. They're just trying to be a little bit more healthy. That's an easy get your foot out the door on your fitness journey type thing. Like if you're doing nothing, take a walk for 15 minutes at your own pace. It doesn't even have to be a sweaty, breathing hard pace. Just take a walk around the neighborhood. You're going to get the sun exposure. You're going to be getting your heart rate up a little bit. You're going to get some energy expenditure. And one thing that they've shown very consistently with just walking is a massive improvement in your mood and affect. It's just it literally makes you feel better. It just like whatever stress you have going on, whatever bad feelings you have, take a walk for 15 minutes. It might not go away, but you'll feel better, right? So that's one of those really simple ones. Like if you find yourself kind of in a funk, you're not quite making your fitness goals, and you don't seem to have the time to do a lot of stuff, start with something simple like walking. Get outside, get some sun, get some light, especially now that we're getting into these winter months. Get that light while you can, and take it slow. Just try and get a couple sessions every week and build up from there.
So underrated. Love it, man. Now, where can folks find out more about you, your work, your social handles, and all that good stuff?
I'm not as active as Dr. Mike on the social media. I usually use mine to like post pictures of my fat manatee-looking cat. But I am RP Dr. James on Instagram. I think I'm just James Hoffman on Facebook. But you can find us on the Renaissance Periodization website. Mike and I have a service we offer called RP Plus, which is there's a huge library of videos and content. But one of the big points is we do a weekly webinar, so you can mail us in questions every week if you want to ask Mike and I my questions. We'll answer your questions the best we can. And then after that, you can find some of our stuff on Amazon, like our RP products. I'm also with the Tudor Bompa Institute on a book called Integrated Periodization, which is like training, nutrition, recovery, psychology for sports. So I'm all over the place.
Awesome, man. I'll link to all that stuff in the show notes. And thank you so much for coming on the pod and sharing your knowledge with us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. It was really fun.
I hope you guys enjoyed that interview with Dr. James Hoffman. And the real takeaway that I want you guys to get from this episode is just to focus on the big rocks, the principles, right? So instead of majoring in the minors, let's focus on the things that are going to give us the best results. So sleep, nutrition, movement, lifestyle, those are the big rocks. And the same thing goes for fat loss, right? We want to focus on the things that are going to give us the biggest returns. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't add on the fancier modalities like the massage and the dry needling, cupping, all that sort of stuff afterwards, but just make sure that you have the principles and the basics in place and you're doing those things really well first before you start going into the fancier stuff. Now, if you're interested in personalized one-on-one nutritional coaching with me, you can go to the website at n1fitness.com/coaching. I'll also have that link in the show notes below. And I will catch you guys on the next episode. See ya.